I love that. You know, from the time that you guys liberated Dachau, and the war was ending within days after that. And, Dachau was the 29th. You liberated that, and then on 30th, you guys were going to Munich. I read that after Dachau, like the day after, that was the day that Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. And so, with these camps being liberated and German soldiers are surrendering, that led up to him to that point in time where that happened with him. So the war was coming to an end at that point in time, and news was traveling that it was ending. But like you were just saying, people were still just unwinding, with the thoughts of that and trying to take it all in. Um, but I imagine the experience of going into these different places that you would go into afterwards, Munich and then Austria and some of the places afterwards, was a different experience.
Well, you see, the last few days after we left Dachau, by another couple of days, we knew the war actually was over because we were riding like on a 2-lane country road, going village after village in southern German Bavaria, going towards Austria. And it was bumper to bumper vehicles, trucks, jeeps, tanks, and it was stop and go, and mostly stop and little go, stop and little go. And by that time, my brother and I were very well versed in German. Because as kids, we grew up, our parents spoke Yiddish, which really is a German dialect. Some of the words are identical. A lot of the words are very, very similar. So we could understand a lot more German than what we could speak, but we could speak pretty good. But we understood a lot of German.
Wow.
During these, and this happened not in one village, but 2 or 3 villages where we were inside a village, and it was time to convoy to stop and then move maybe a few yards and then stop. And on both sides of the road, the houses were very close to the road itself. So some of them were 2-story homes with a balcony. Those that had 2 stories and a balcony would have the civilians on the balcony with white sheets that surrender, whatever. And they were all cheering. They welcomed the American soldiers. They were scared to death of the Russian soldiers, which there were no Russian soldiers in that part of Germany, but they knew enough to be. They wouldn't welcome Russian soldiers for good reason. But anyhow, like in a rehearsed chorus, they all spoke with one message: the war will not end until you defeat the Russians. We heard that over and over. Think about it. They just scared to death of the Russians, and they really wanted the Allied forces to defeat the Russians. So that's when the war would really be over, not until. The American army could have gone into Berlin before the Russians, or at least at the same time, but from a different direction. But the American general said, let the Russians go in and let them lose soldiers. And that's what happened. And so the Russians, that's why they went into Berlin first and took control. And of course, they did a lot of losses until they were able to get Berlin under control. And then that's when they got together, the four parties got together and divided up into different sections. Well, in other words, the American generals in charge, they knew they could go into Berlin before or at the same time the Russians would come in, but of course from a different direction. But they decided, let the Russians go in and lose some of their soldiers. Let's keep the American soldiers safe and let the Russians go in and take over Berlin. And that's what happened. And that was the difference. So the Russians had, of course, losses. They lost a lot of soldiers till they were able to get Berlin under control. So I wouldn't fault the American generals for taking that position, because after the war, they divided Berlin up into four sections. So they achieved their objective, but let the Russians lose more soldiers. In fact, what happened during the Army of Occupation, each soldier was allowed a weekly ration. Each soldier could buy one carton of cigarettes for 50 cents. Each carton contained 10 packs of cigarettes. That meant each pack of cigarettes cost a nickel. So here, my brother and I didn't smoke. Every week we got our ration of 10 packs of cigarettes. You could get one bar of soap, 2 candy bars. That was your ration every week if you wanted to buy it. Well, of course, we bought everything we could get in our ration weekly because we used it as barter. Like the first house that we lived in a German town in Bavaria called Kiefersfelden, not too far from the Austrian border. Well, they had the Hausfraus, had several 2- and 3-story houses that the only people in them was an elderly woman, a Hausfrau. So they had them move out of a few of the houses into neighbors' houses, moved in with other neighbors, so we could live in those houses. That was the first time we got to sleep in a bed, a real bed, after over 4 months of combat. So anyhow, so in our house that I lived in, the housefrau would come every morning to make our beds, wash the linens if necessary, wash our clothes. Any dirty clothes we had, they would just wash them. And so we would pay her with cigarettes, pack of cigarettes or candy bar, whatever. That's how we bartered for her services, in other words. And then, of course, she would have that to use as barter to get something that she needed from some other civilians that had something different. And that's the way it worked. In fact, I mentioned Bad Gastein in the Austrian Alps. These resort hotels, before the war, they were famous spas. People came from Europe, other countries, to take these health baths. Well, the baths were not like bathtubs. They were units that you would step down. They had steps. You would just step down the steps and stand up so that the radium water would come up to your shoulders. And you were only allowed to stay in, you could not stay in the water longer than 10 minutes. That was the maximum. They said because of the radium water, you don't want to stay in there longer than 10 minutes. And that was the arrangement. They also had next to the baths, because these were all in the basement of every hotel, they had the civilian masseuses, because during the war, the Germans kept the civilian personnel the women, and believe me, several of those women could have been football players. That's how they were built. Big guards, tackles. I mean, boy, they were really strong women.
Mm-hmm.
Giving you massages. So they had the hotels turned into convalescent units for German wounded soldiers. And then so they kept the civilian help there to fix the food, feed them, meals, everything. So it just so happened in August of 1945, every United States division in Europe formed a football team. So I filled out an application, see if I could get on the 42nd Division football team, and I was accepted. And that's how I ended up in one of those luxury hotels in Dachau.
Wow.
And that was our training camp. And we had a practice field not too far away where we practiced every day. And when we'd come in from practice, because the practice was during the morning hours, we would come in, get in one of those health baths, and then take turns having a nice massage, which was great. Because we used to scrimmage, so you get little nicks and bruises in the health bath, and then the massage really was. It was about 4 months of the best Army experience I had.
I was gonna say that doesn't sound like anything like the combat that you were in, and sleeping on the ground and living in camps.
It was very nice, and I remember the first evening meal when we arrived, and the first thing they served me and others was what the Germans call Knädel soup. In Yiddish, it's the same thing, Knädel, same word. And today, more recent years in this country, we call it matzo ball soup.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when the female server put the bowl of soup in front of me, and as she was putting the bowls to the other people sitting at my table, and I was already tasting it, I said, sehr good Knädel soup. She said, how did you know what it was? But so we had good food, good meals. We had, since it was wintertime, they gave us special jackets, white on the outside, sheep lined on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
I have a picture of me in one of these jackets. Not regular Army issue, but beautiful, very nice. These heavy winter jackets to wear when we were walking around outside after practice in the afternoons, whatever. So we used to fly around. Well, sometimes if we had a game in Salzburg, we would ride the trucks into Salzburg to have a game. If it was some city around Europe, we would fly. We had like 3 DC airplanes, not comfortable. They were the same type airplanes in combat that the parachute used to fly in and parachute out. So they were just bucket seats on both sides of the aircraft with a center aisle, but it served the purpose. And I remember 2 games in particular. One was in Czechoslovakia, not too far from Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Well, it was occupied by the Russians. So they refused permission for our 3 DC airplanes to land nearby. For some crazy, the war was over, but they refused permission. So we had to ride in trucks from the Austrian Alps, Bad Gastein, to Czechoslovakia.
Wow.
Well, that was a Friday because the game was only supposed to be Saturday after lunch. and it started snowing. Well, it snowed all night. We got up the next morning, Saturday morning, it was still snowing. So our coaches contacted the Russian authorities to see if they could postpone the game till Sunday, thinking maybe the snow would stop. Russian says, "Niet." They have a soccer match scheduled for the same field on Sunday. So that's out. Either play the game or cancel it. Well, I had never played football in snow before. So that was my first experience.
Hmm.
And all they did was outline the out of bounds of the field, but everything else was snow covered. We didn't know if we were on the 30-yard line or the 40-yard line. We just knew we were somewhere on the field. This would have been sometime in December.
Oh, in December.
December of 45.
December 45.
I'm sorry. Yeah, December of 45.
Mm.
So that was the experience, but it wasn't a total loss. I mean, we played the game, we won barely, but it was the only game that I went to the coach when he took me out of the game. And I was sitting very cold on the bench. And the only game I went to the coach, I said, "Coach, I need to get back in the game to warm up."
Now they were letting you play these games was that after you had left the military, or were you still in the military?
We were in the military until March of 1946
Okay.
when we took a ship home and then be discharged. But the other game I remember was played in Nuremberg, the stadium that Hitler used to review the troops.
Mm-hmm.
They changed after the war. I was told they changed the name well after we left to Soldiers Field. And so we played the Big Red One football team. We had a 6-game schedule, and that was the only game we lost.
Oh.
6-0. I managed to keep the football game programs 3 or 4. I think it was 3 different games. That was one of them. The one in Czechoslovakia was another one. That was the 91st Division team, which I ended up sending them to division headquarters in New York, which still is there, where they have a museum. So I thought they were better there than me keeping them in a desk file here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the programs ended up. But before sending them, my son he scanned and copied the program, so I got it on the computer.
Nice.
Need the actual programs, but we were still crowned European champions, and for being European champions, they gave us each a little miniature silver football. I still have it. Big deal.
That's so awesome. That would be cool to see. Now, how did you get started in playing football? Because you've been talking about that, but how was it did they let you guys get involved in recreational
Well, it just so
opportunities while you were still there?
well, that was for morale purposes. Officers were only allowed to be coaches. They could not play because they were concerned if an officer was on a playing team, then maybe a tackle or a guard on the other side would clobber them on purpose. Whatever. So our head coach had been before coming into the service, he was the head coach of Tulsa University.
Mm.
We had a couple of players that always stuck out in my mind. One was a defensive end. He made, as a freshman at least, Lehigh University before coming into the service. He made a little All-American team. And boy, he was a hard-hitting player, I can tell you that. Then we had another one that was a offensive guard. He got a full scholarship after he was discharged to LSU University, made all Southeastern Conference and so forth. But it just so happened that when I was in school, the seventh, eighth grade, in the neighborhood, we used to play touch football. We couldn't afford it. We didn't have money for uniforms or anything like that. So that's how I got started in football. My twin brother Howard, both and myself, we played touch football. So when I was in the ninth grade, I heard through the grapevine that there was a high school team that was short of players. So they were looking for some football players that wasn't necessarily part of their school. So I heard about it. I went out for the team, and it was called the Commodores. And so I went out, knew where they practiced. I went out and somehow I made the team. And that was a good experience. And I have a picture of me in a football uniform on the back side of the picture. It has the date. That's how I knew I was in the ninth grade. And the football team was a Catholic high school, a small Catholic high school, and they didn't have enough players. They wanted more players. And that's how I got on the team. So here was a Jewish kid playing high school team.
So I bet you showed them Jewish kids could play too.
But I remember the coach, his name was John Lenahan, and before he became the coach, he was the fourth string center for Notre Dame University. Fourth string. Because in those days, Notre Dame University was one of the top college football teams in the country. But I remember him very well. He was a very good guy, nice guy. And then, so then that way, when I got into high school, the 10th grade, I already had this experience. In those days, you could only, like, my high school team was Andrew Jackson Tigers. So the 10th grade team was called the Baby Tigers. So to play on the varsity, you had to play 10th grade, you had to play on the baby team. So I played on that. And then I got on the varsity 11th grade and 12th grade. I made the varsity both those years. And then I went to the university. My brother and I both, a little over a month after Pearl Harbor, we went to the University of Florida as freshmen. And originally I went out for the football team because the quarterback of my high school team, he got a full scholarship to the University of Florida as a quarterback. And one of my best friends, another Jewish kid, he was an offensive guard. He also went out. So because the two of them went out for the team, okay, I'll go out for the team. But after some practices, I decided I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't good enough because I knew there was a kid from St. Petersburg that was a halfback like I was, and I knew he was an all-star and I wasn't. So I said, well, that's not a future for me. I got to concentrate on my studies. That's why I left the team. But it just so happened, and maybe this is why I got on the division team, because when I was accepted and I got to the first practice, one of the assistant coaches was an assistant coach at the University of Florida. So I figured, well, that's probably why I was able to get on the team. I don't know. I just was happy to get there. But one afternoon after practice, Pat Gaston, my roommate, who was not a player. He was the equipment manager, but he was my roommate. So one afternoon after practice, he and I were walking around town of Bad Gastein, and there were 4 of these survivors approaching us. I recognized one of them for a particular reason, so I stopped, and in my German Yiddish, I said, it's nice to see you guys are okay, and just a little small talk, and we walked away from it. And as we walked away, my roommate said, well, I guess Hitler didn't get them all. But he didn't know I was Jewish. So I told him, I said, I'm sorry, but you don't know it. I happen to be Jewish and you just offended me. He didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know what to say. He just took off.
Wow.
And even though he was my roommate, he tried to avoid me for about a week as much as he possibly could avoid me. So finally I said, look, we have to sit down and talk.
Mm-hmm.
He agreed to it. And I asked him, why would you say something like that? What? So he explained to me that he was born on a farm in Oklahoma. And he said occasionally when his father would hook up the wagon to go into town to buy provisions for the family, and sometimes he'd go into a clothing store and buy some different clothes for the children, whatever. So he said there were maybe 3 occasions where his father would ask him, did he want to go with him into town? So he said on all 3 occasions he went with his father. The first place they would stop would be a clothing store. His father would pick out different clothing items for the different kids. And then they'd stop at another store to get different canned goods, whatever. And then all the way back to the farm, his father would tell him the same message. Those stores, Jewish people, owned by Jewish people, they got life so easy. They make all the money off of us poor farmers, and we work so hard. And they have such a good life, taking advantage of us poor farmers. And he says he never met and really talked to, because he stayed on the wagon outside when his father would go into these stores. So he said he never met any Jewish person. He never talked to any Jewish person. So he only got the message. So he thought Jewish people were horrible people based on what his father kept telling him. So that was the basis, the reason why he said what he said.
Wow.
So after that, everything was okay again. I understood where he came from, and he understood where I came from.
Right. And all that time you were living together, so he could see that you were, a good person. And I'm sure he had to think about that.
Well, there were, two soldiers in each room, hotel room. So he was my roommate. But after, they were okay. And then, of course, I lost track of him after the season was over because I had to go back to my unit, which was and I got back to my unit. We were living in an old monastery near Salzburg. And I got back to the unit just in time for a nice Christmas dinner.